Three David Sling batteries protecting metropolitan Tel Aviv went dark within 17 minutes of the first drone detection, and according to Israeli Defense Forces preliminary assessments released through military channels, the systems never fired a single interceptor before losing operational capability. The defensive architecture protecting Israel's commercial and population center, built across 2 decades at a cost exceeding $4 billion and designed specifically to create layered redundancy against precisely this type of coordinated assault, simply ceased functioning as a swarm of low-cost unmanned aerial vehicles executed what military analysts are now describing as the most sophisticated penetration of integrated air defense networks witnessed in modern combat. The attack represents not merely a tactical setback or isolated battlefield incident, but rather a fundamental challenge to the defensive doctrines that have governed Israeli strategic planning since the Second Lebanon War, and the implications extend far beyond the immediate damage to hardware positioned around Tel Aviv. Understanding why this particular attack carries such profound strategic weight requires examining what David Sling was designed to prevent and how completely those design assumptions have now been invalidated. The system entered operational deployment in 2017 as the middle layer of Israel's integrated air defense architecture, positioned between the short-range Iron Dome installations handling rockets and mortars and the long-range Arrow systems designed to intercept ballistic missiles at high altitude. David Sling employs the Stunner Interceptor, also designated as the Skyceptor in international marketing materials, which combines hit-to-kill kinetic warheads with sophisticated radar guidance systems capable of engaging aircraft, cruise missiles, and tactical ballistic missiles at ranges extending beyond 200 kilometers. The 3 batteries protecting Tel Aviv operated as network nodes, sharing radar data and targeting information through the Israeli Air Force's centralized battle management architecture, creating overlapping coverage zones designed to ensure that the failure or suppression of any single battery would not create exploitable gaps in the defensive umbrella. That networked redundancy was supposed to prevent exactly what occurred when the drone swarm penetrated the defensive perimeter. According to reports from Israeli military sources cited in defensive publications analyzing the attack, the swarm consisted of approximately 120 unmanned aerial vehicles launched from multiple vectors simultaneously, with initial detections occurring over the Mediterranean approaching from the northwest, overland routes from the northeast passing through Lebanese airspace, and southern vectors transiting Jordanian territory before turning toward Israeli airspace. The timing synchronization across these dispersed launch points suggests sophisticated coordination capabilities and operational planning that military analysts note would typically require state-level intelligence and command infrastructure rather than the decentralized networks commonly associated with non-state actors. The drones themselves appear to have included a mix of platforms with varying capabilities, including larger commercial derivative systems carrying electronic warfare packages, smaller disposable units designed for saturation, and specialized variants equipped with anti-radiation sensors capable of homing on active radar emissions. The attack sequence began with the electronic warfare-equipped drones, which Israeli radar operators reportedly detected first as they approached from maritime vectors at low altitude, exploiting ground clutter and sea return to complicate tracking. These lead elements began broadcasting across multiple frequency ranges once they crossed into Israeli airspace, creating electromagnetic interference that degraded but did not completely suppress Israeli radar coverage. The David Sling batteries responded by activating their organic radar systems to achieve tracking locks on the approaching threats, which is precisely the behavior the anti-radiation-equipped drones in the second wave were designed to exploit. According to technical analysis from defense contractors familiar with the David Sling architecture published in industry journals following the attack, the Stunner Interceptor requires continuous radar illumination of the target throughout the intercept sequence, meaning the batteries must maintain active emissions even while under attack by systems designed to home on those exact emissions. The Israeli battery commanders faced an impossible tactical dilemma that reveals the fundamental vulnerability exploited by the swarm architecture. Maintaining radar emissions provided the anti-radiation drones with precise homing vectors directly to the battery locations, but shutting down the radars would render the Stunner interceptors incapable of engaging any of the approaching threats. The commanders chose to maintain emissions and attempt intercepts, which allowed the anti-radiation drones to strike the radar installations and battle management nodes that coordinate targeting between the interceptor launchers and the tracking sensors. Once those coordination systems sustained damage, the batteries lost the ability to prosecute intercepts even though the individual launcher units and many of the stunner missiles themselves remained physically intact and undamaged. Military analysts examining the tactical timeline note that this represents exactly the kind of system-level vulnerability that emerges when defensive architectures depend on centralized battle management and network coordination, rather than organic targeting capability at the individual platform level. The third wave of the swarm consisted of the expendable saturation drones, which arrived as the batteries were attempting to restore coordination capability and assess damage from the anti-radiation strikes. These platforms, which intelligence assessments suggest may have been simple commercial quadcopters modified to carry small explosive charges, lacked the range or payload to present significant threats to hardened military infrastructure under normal circumstances. However, with the battle management systems disrupted and the organic radar arrays damaged, the batteries had no effective means of tracking or engaging the small, slow-moving platforms despite possessing more than adequate interceptor inventory to eliminate every drone in the swarm if the coordination infrastructure had remained functional. The saturation drones struck the launcher units, command vehicles, and power generation systems that had survived the initial anti-radiation wave, completing the systematic degradation of the batteries from operationally ready defensive systems to damaged hardware requiring extensive reconstitution before returning to service. Israeli Defense Forces statements released approximately 8 hours after the attack confirmed that all 3 David Sling batteries protecting the Tel Aviv metropolitan area had been rendered non-operational and provided preliminary casualty figures indicating 12 military personnel killed and 37 wounded, though those figures were accompanied by the standard caveat that complete accounting remained ongoing. The statements characterized the attack as employing unprecedented coordination and technical sophistication, while emphasizing that Israeli air defense architecture includes multiple redundant layers, and that the David Sling batteries represented only one component of the integrated defensive network. However, the fact that the statements felt compelled to emphasize redundancy and layered defense reveals the strategic anxiety underlying the tactical explanations, because the entire premise of that layered architecture is that sophisticated adversaries should not be able to simultaneously suppress multiple layers using relatively low-cost unmanned platforms. The economic asymmetry exposed by the attack represents one of the most troubling strategic dimensions from the Israeli perspective. Each David Sling battery costs approximately $400 million to procure and deploy, with individual stunner interceptors carrying unit costs estimated between $1 million and $2 million depending on configuration and procurement volumes. The total value of the 3 disabled batteries, including the interceptor inventory stored at each site, likely exceeds $1.5 billion. Against this, intelligence assessments of the attacking drone swarm suggest total procurement costs for the entire platform mix may have ranged between $5 and $15 million, assuming the electronic warfare and anti-radiation variants were purpose-built military systems rather than commercial derivatives with added packages. Even accounting for the command infrastructure, intelligence preparation, and launch coordination required to execute the attack, the cost-exchange ratio appears to favor the attacking force by at least 2 orders of magnitude. This cost asymmetry creates strategic sustainability problems that extend beyond the immediate tactical setback. Israel maintains approximately 9 David Sling batteries deployed across the country protecting critical infrastructure, population centers, and strategic assets, with reported plans to expand the force structure to 12 batteries to address emerging threats from Hezbollah's expanding missile arsenal and Iranian cruise missile capabilities. Reconstituting the 3 damaged batteries will require not only replacing or repairing the damaged hardware, which will consume months and potentially hundreds of millions of dollars, but also implementing modifications to address the tactical vulnerabilities exploited during the attack. However, any modifications that might mitigate vulnerability to anti-radiation drones or electronic warfare could potentially degrade performance against the cruise missiles and tactical ballistic missiles the system was originally designed to intercept, forcing Israeli defense planners to optimize for different threat profiles with systems that may not be able to simultaneously address all vectors. The intelligence failure dimension adds another layer of strategic concern that Israeli officials are addressing more obliquely than the tactical and technical aspects. for a coordinated drone swarm launch from multiple vectors to achieve simultaneous arrival over Tel Aviv requires detailed operational planning, including precise timing calculations, launcher positioning to achieve desired approach vectors, and intelligence about Israeli radar coverage patterns and defensive response protocols. According to security analysts quoted in Israeli media coverage, this level of operational sophistication suggests the attacking force possessed detailed understanding of how the David sling batteries would respond to drone incursions, what activation sequences the radar systems would employ, and where the critical vulnerabilities existed in the battle management architecture. That intelligence could have been gathered through sustained observation of Israeli defensive responses during previous smaller-scale drone incursions, signals intelligence collection against the radar emissions the batteries generate during routine operations, or human intelligence sources with access to tactical doctrine and deployment details. The strategic timing of the attack adds additional complexity to the intelligence assessment. The strike occurred less than 72 hours after the Israeli Defense Forces announced the successful interception of a cruise missile salvo launched from Syria using David sling batteries deployed in the north, with official statements emphasizing the system's reliability and combat effectiveness. Military analysts examining the timeline note that the Tel Aviv attack could represent either a pre-planned operation whose timing coincidentally followed the successful northern intercept, or a rapid response strike specifically designed to exploit the defensive posture and system deployment patterns revealed during the northern engagement. If the attack represents rapid planning and execution following observation of Israeli defensive responses in the north, that capability would indicate even more sophisticated intelligence gathering and operational flexibility than a pre-planned strike would require. Regional actors are processing the attack's implications through their own strategic calculations about Israeli military credibility and deterrence sustainability. According to diplomatic cables cited in regional press coverage, Saudi and Emirati officials have privately expressed concern that the penetration of Israeli air defenses could embolden Iranian proxy forces throughout the region and potentially undermine the security assurances that led to recent normalization agreements. If Israeli military superiority proves less decisive than the agreements assumed, the strategic calculation supporting normalization begins to erode. Hezbollah's response to the attack, communicated through statements from officials quoted in Lebanese media outlets, emphasized that the operation demonstrated the vulnerability of Israeli strategic infrastructure. Intelligence analysts note that Hezbollah maintains an unmanned aerial vehicle program dating back more than 15 years and has accumulated extensive operational experience through deployments in Syria. If Hezbollah chooses to test Israeli air defenses using similar swarm tactics against batteries protecting northern Israel, the defensive challenge would intensify significantly because the shorter flight distances from Lebanese launch sites would compress warning time available for Israeli commanders. The American dimension introduces additional strategic complexity because the David sling system was developed as a joint Israeli-American program, with substantial funding from United States missile defense budgets and technical contributions from Raytheon. According to Pentagon statements responding to press inquiries about the attack, American military officials are conducting detailed assessments to identify lessons applicable to United States air defense architecture. The fact that a jointly developed system deployed by a close ally has suffered such comprehensive defeat by relatively low-cost platforms creates uncomfortable questions about whether American integrated air defense networks might face similar challenges from Chinese or Russian drone swarms. The technological implications extend beyond the immediate participants because the attack demonstrates that sophisticated coordination and multi-vector timing can achieve defensive penetration without requiring cutting-edge hardware. The drones employed appear to have included substantial numbers of commercial derivative platforms that any moderately resourced adversary could procure through open markets, with critical technical advantages coming from operational planning rather than breakthrough hardware developments. This accessibility means the tactical template demonstrated could potentially be replicated by a wide range of state and non-state actors globally. Israeli defense officials have announced an immediate operational response, including redeployment of Iron Dome batteries to provide interim coverage over Tel Aviv, while the David sling systems undergo damage assessment and reconstitution, activation of additional radar systems to compensate for the coverage gaps created by the battery losses, and enhanced fighter patrols over strategic infrastructure to provide airborne interception capability against potential follow-on drone attacks. However, These interim measures carry their own costs and complications because redeploying Iron Dome batteries from other areas creates coverage gaps in those regions. Additional radar activation increases the emission signature available for adversary intelligence collection, and sustained fighter patrols consume flight hours and maintenance capacity while tying down aircraft that might be needed for other missions if the conflict escalates across additional fronts. The longer-term Israeli response will necessarily involve both technical modifications to address tactical vulnerabilities and strategic adjustments to defensive doctrine. Technical modifications might include developing interceptors capable of engaging small, slow-moving targets without requiring continuous radar illumination, integrating optical and acoustic sensors to supplement radar tracking, and creating distributed battle management systems that preserve engagement capability when centralized coordination nodes sustain damage. However, each modification will require substantial development time and procurement funding, and changes to fundamental system architecture could potentially compromise performance against ballistic missiles and cruise missiles that David's sling was originally optimized to intercept. The strategic doctrine implications challenge fundamental assumptions about air defense system design. The traditional approach emphasized centralized battle management to maximize coordination efficiency, with redundant coverage zones ensuring that gaps created by battle damage would be covered by adjacent batteries. The Tel Aviv attack suggests that centralized battle management creates single points of failure that sophisticated adversaries can exploit. Some defense analysts examining the attack have suggested that effective defense against drone swarms may require fundamentally different approaches, including distributed engagement authority, where individual platforms make autonomous intercept decisions, massive numerical overmatch, where defensive systems deploy far more interceptors than attacking swarms can present targets, or acceptance that point defense of specific high-value targets may be more achievable than area defense of entire population centers. The political pressures mounting on Israeli leadership add urgency because the attack occurred in the geographic and psychological heart of Israel. Tel Aviv represents not merely another city requiring defensive coverage, but rather the symbolic and practical center of Israeli civilian life. The fact that adversaries demonstrated the capability to penetrate defenses over Tel Aviv and disable multiple batteries without effective Israeli response creates public anxiety extending beyond military specialist communities. According to polling data from Israeli research organizations cited in domestic press coverage, public approval ratings for defense officials have declined substantially following the attack. Opposition political figures have seized on the attack to criticize defense procurement decisions, with statements arguing that excessive investment in high-cost systems optimized for yesterday's threats diverted resources from addressing emerging drone capabilities. The political pressure creates incentives for defense officials to demonstrate rapid, visible responses, regardless of whether those responses address underlying strategic challenges. Regional escalation dynamics add layers of complexity because the success of the Tel Aviv attack creates incentives for additional actors to test Israeli defenses using similar approaches while Israeli systems remain degraded and before modifications can be implemented. According to intelligence assessments cited in regional media coverage, Iranian forces operating in Syria have expanded drone production facilities and increased launch training exercises in the weeks following the Tel Aviv attack, suggesting preparations for potential follow-on operations against Israeli territory. Simultaneously, Palestinian militant groups in Gaza have reportedly increased drone launch attempts probing Israeli coverage over southern cities, though Israeli Iron Dome batteries have maintained higher success rates against these less sophisticated incursions. The pattern suggests that adversaries across multiple fronts are studying the lessons from Tel Aviv and attempting to identify opportunities to exploit defensive weaknesses before Israeli reconstitution efforts restore capability. The fundamental question emerging from the attack's aftermath involves whether the tactical success represents an isolated exploit of specific vulnerabilities that technical modifications can address, or whether it demonstrates more fundamental challenges to the entire paradigm of high-cost precision air defense systems attempting to defeat large numbers of low-cost attacking platforms through technological superiority and coordination efficiency. If sophisticated adversaries can reliably penetrate even the most advanced integrated air defense networks by combining coordination, electronic warfare, and numerical saturation using platforms costing orders of magnitude less than the defensive systems attempting to stop them, then the economic sustainability of comprehensive territorial air defense becomes questionable. Israeli defense budgets cannot sustain continuous replacement of billion-dollar battery systems defeated by million-dollar drone swarms, and the arithmetic of cost exchange ratios suggests that adversaries could maintain offensive pressure indefinitely, even if Israeli defenses achieved much higher success rates than the Tel Aviv attack demonstrated. American strategic planners are watching the Israeli experience with particular attention because the United States faces potential adversaries with vastly greater resources and industrial capacity than the forces currently testing Israeli defenses. If Hezbollah and Iranian proxies can assemble drone swarms capable of penetrating Israeli air defense networks, Chinese military forces with defense budgets exceeding $200 billion annually could potentially field drone capabilities several orders of magnitude more sophisticated and numerous. The implications for American force protection in potential Western Pacific contingencies involving Taiwan become deeply troubling if naval battle groups and forward-deployed air bases cannot reliably defend against coordinated drone swarms employed at scale. The technical approaches and tactical innovations demonstrated during the Tel Aviv attack provide adversary planners with proven templates for offensive operations against integrated air defense networks, while American defensive systems employ many of the same centralized battle management and radar-dependent intercept approaches that proved vulnerable during the Israeli engagement. The uncertainty about how this tactical breakthrough fits within broader strategic trajectories remains the most consequential dimension as Israeli officials, regional actors, and global military planners attempt to extract lessons from the Tel Aviv attack. Some analysts interpret the successful penetration as validation of long-predicted shifts in the character of warfare where mass and cost asymmetry increasingly favor offensive operations over defensive systems, suggesting that air defense architectures may face fundamental sustainability challenges as unmanned systems proliferate globally. Other assessments treat the attack as exploitation of specific vulnerabilities in particular systems rather than invalidation of air defense as a strategic concept, arguing that technical modifications and tactical adjustments can restore defensive effectiveness against drone swarms without requiring wholesale reconception of defensive doctrine. What remains clear is that the baseline assumptions governing Israeli air defense planning have been challenged by battlefield realities in ways that cannot be addressed through incremental adjustments or business-as-usual procurement processes. Whether Israeli officials respond with fundamental strategic reassessment or attempt to restore previous approaches through technical modifications will determine whether the Tel Aviv attack represents a temporary setback or the beginning of extended vulnerability as adversaries refine and expand drone swarm capabilities faster than defensive systems can adapt. The regional actors observing Israeli responses are making their own calculations about whether to increase pressure while vulnerabilities persist or exercise restraint to avoid provoking Israeli escalation that might trigger wider regional conflict. American planners are conducting urgent assessments about whether United States defensive systems face similar vulnerabilities and what modifications might be necessary to address drone swarm threats before potential adversaries demonstrate equivalent capabilities against American assets. The next phase of this escalating confrontation will reveal whether the tactical template demonstrated during the Tel Aviv attack remains viable as defensive systems adapt, whether adversaries can expand and refine drone swarm capabilities faster than defenses can evolve to counter them, and whether the economic asymmetries favoring offensive drone operations prove sustainable across extended campaigns requiring continuous platform production and replacement. Those answers will determine not merely the trajectory of the Israeli-Iranian shadow war playing out across multiple regional fronts, but potentially the broader future of air defense as a strategic concept and the viability of protecting population centers and critical infrastructure against adversaries willing to invest in large-scale unmanned systems employed with sophisticated coordination and tactical innovation. The three silent David sling batteries positioned around Tel Aviv stand as monuments to the uncertainty now defining military planning across contested regions worldwide.